You're done here, Daniel. Effective immediately. Security will walk you to your car.
14 years, and this is the thank you note. She signed the papers the same morning. A gavel of applause that never came, just silence. Just the particular silence of people who know something is wrong and have decided it isn't their problem. Nobody in that boardroom knew what I still owned. Nobody in that boardroom had read the trust. My name is Daniel Okafor. I'm 47 years old. I believe a company is nothing but the sum of the problems it's willing to solve quietly, before anyone notices there was a problem at all. I was wrong about one thing, though. I thought the same principle applied to a marriage. It doesn't. In a marriage, the quiet ones get erased first. The boardroom on the 14th floor of Meridian Logistics has a view of the Atlanta skyline that I used to love, back when I thought a view was something you earned, instead of something you got escorted away from. That Tuesday in March, the light came in low and gold through the west windows. The kind of light makes even ugly rooms look like something worth remembering. I remember a coffee cup someone had left on the table, a ring of condensation soaking into the grain of the wood, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that somebody should get a coaster before it stains. That was the last normal thought I had before the room stopped being mine. Renata sat at the head of the table. She'd had that seat for 3 years, ever since the board voted her in as CEO on my own recommendation, my own signature on the nomination letter, my own voice in the room saying she was the person to take Meridian into its next chapter. She was wearing the navy suit she wore for earnings calls, the one that photographed well. Her hands were flat on the table, and I noticed, in that strange sideways way you notice things, when your whole life is falling out from under you, that her knuckles had gone white. The kind of white that happens when someone is gripping something so hard it hurts, even when their voice stays, even and their face stays composed. She was performing calm. I'd spent 17 years learning to read the difference between calm and the performance of it. First as an engineer reading, whether a system was actually stable or just quiet before a crash. Then as a husband reading whether my wife was actually fine or just telling me she was. The board has voted, she said, to restructure the CTO position out of the executive team, effective today. We want to thank you for your foundational contributions to this company. Foundational. Past tense, like a building, like something you pour concrete for and then walk away from. Before we get into what happened next, I want you to sit with something for a second. There's a particular kind of confidence that only exists in people who believe they've already won. It's a loud kind of confidence, even when it's whispered. And the strange, useful thing about people who believe they've already won is that they stop being careful. They start explaining things they didn't need to explain. They start naming numbers out loud that a more careful person would have kept to themselves. Keep that in mind. It matters later. 2 security guards were already standing near the door, which told me the timing hadn't been a surprise to anyone but me. Marcus Webb, our head of security, a man I'd hired myself 6 years earlier when he was between jobs and needed a favor, wouldn't meet my eyes. I understood. He had a mortgage and 2 kids in private school, and a boss who could end his employment with a signature. I didn't blame him. I filed it away instead, the way you file away every small thing when you've decided, somewhere in the back half of your mind, that a day is coming when small things will matter. Beside Renata sat 2 board members I barely recognized outside of quarterly meetings, and beside them, a chair I hadn't expected. Occupied by a woman from outside counsel, whose firm's name I recognized from the letterhead of divorce filings my own lawyer had mentioned only that morning, which told me the 2 proceedings had never been separate at all, only staged to look that way for as long as it was convenient. I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. Somebody in the room, I never found out who, let out a breath, like they'd been holding it the whole meeting, waiting to see if I'd make a scene. I didn't give them one. Anger is a poor tenant. It moves into a room and breaks the furniture and leaves before it pays what it owes. I'd learned that a long time before that Tuesday, watching men twice my age burn down 20 years of relationships in 20 minutes because they couldn't let a slight go unanswered. I picked up my coffee cup, the one leaving the ring on the table, and I said, "Thank you all for your time." And I walked out between the two guards like I was leading them, instead of the other way around. Renata didn't watch me leave. She was already looking down at her phone. I found out about the divorce filing 40 minutes later, sitting in my car in the parking garage, when my lawyer called to say the papers had been delivered to my office that morning, addressed to me, time to land in my inbox while I was being walked out of the building. Efficient. Renata had always been efficient. It was one of the things I loved about her once, the way she could make 100 moving pieces line up on schedule. I hadn't understood, until that day, that she'd apply the same discipline to ending a marriage that she applied to a product launch. I want to tell you how it started, because none of this makes sense without the beginning, and the beginning is not what you'd expect. 14 years before that Tuesday. Meridian Logistics was 4 people in a rented office above a dry cleaner in East Point. And the only thing we had that was worth anything was a piece of routing software I'd written myself, nights and weekends, while working a day job as a systems engineer for a freight company that would go bankrupt 2 years later without ever knowing what it had let walk out the door. I built that software because I was tired of watching trucks burn diesel driving in circles, tired of dispatchers doing math on napkins, tired of a whole industry pretending inefficiency was just the cost of doing business. I didn't build it to get rich. I built it because bad systems offend something in me the way an off-key note offends a musician. Renata came into the picture through a mutual friend, an operations consultant who'd heard about the software and thought it needed a business mind behind it, someone who could sell what I could only build. She was sharp in the specific way that made rooms rearrange themselves around her without her raising her voice. And I liked that about her immediately, the same quality I'd later learned to be wary of. We were married within 2 years of meeting. The company grew inside the marriage like another child we were raising together. And for a long time, I believed that was exactly what it was. Her family made their entrance a year into the marriage, and the entrance was gentle, the way a manipulative entrance always is at first. Her older brother, Corbin, showed up at our engagement dinner with a bottle of wine that cost more than my monthly car payment at the time, and he raised a toast that made my own mother cry. Something about family looking out for family, about how blood finds its way back together even when life scatters it. Her mother sent food for months after the wedding, foil trays of jollof rice and stew that showed up on our porch like clockwork, always with a note that said something small and warm, thinking of you two. Hope this helps with the new baby coming. Before there was a baby coming, it felt like being adopted into something larger than myself. It took me years to understand that a family that gives you warmth before you've asked for anything is sometimes preparing the ground for a request they haven't made yet. The first irregularity was small enough that I almost missed it, the way you almost miss a hairline crack in a foundation because the house still stands. Corbin joined Meridian's board 2 years after the wedding, a seat Renata pushed for as a strategic advisor position. And within 6 months, he'd proposed a vendor contract for logistics insurance that routed through a company he had a minority stake in, a company none of us, including me, had vetted properly, because Renata vouched for it, and I trusted Renata's vouching the way I trusted gravity. I noticed the markup. I noticed it was 11% higher than 3 competing quotes I pulled myself quietly, on a Sunday afternoon when nobody was watching. I said something to Renata. She said Corbin was family, and family gets the benefit of the doubt, and I let it go, because 11% on an insurance line item felt like a small hill to die on for a marriage I intended to keep for the rest of my life. I didn't die on that hill. But I did that same week, quietly move my founding shares of Meridian into a trust, structured through an estate attorney named Walter Greaves, who I'd found through a colleague, a man in his 60s who spoke slowly and asked more questions than he answered. I told myself it was ordinary estate planning, the kind any founder should do, protecting the company's core equity from the ordinary chaos of life. Illness, lawsuits, divorce, though I didn't let myself think the word divorce all the way through at the time. The trust held sole voting authority over my founding shares, structured so that my public role could shrink, could even disappear, without the voting power ever transferring to whoever occupied that public role. On paper, after the restructuring the board voted in 3 years later, I was Chief Technology Officer, advisory capacity. In the trust documents, I was still the only vote that mattered when it mattered most. I recruited as exactly one person into what I was building that year. Though, at the time it didn't feel like recruitment, it felt like hiring an assistant. Priya Chandrasekaran was 26 when she joined Meridian, sharp enough that she caught inconsistencies in vendor contracts before I pointed them out to her, quiet enough that half the executive floor forgot she was in the room, which she used to her advantage more than anyone realized. She'd come to us from a smaller logistics firm in Charlotte that had folded under mismanagement she'd tried, unsuccessfully, to flag to leadership before it collapsed. And she told me once, early on, that she'd promised herself she'd never again sit quietly through a company's slow-motion failure without at least trying to name it out loud first. That history mattered more than I understood at the time. I sat her down 8 months into her employment, in a coffee shop 3 blocks from the office, away from cameras and open floor plans, and I gave her one instruction. If anything ever happens to me at this company, anything that looks sudden, I want you to call Walter Greaves before you call anyone else. Not HR, not legal. Walter Greaves. I gave her his number written on a physical card, not a text message, not an email, because paper doesn't get subpoenaed the way a server does. She asked me why. I told her some doors you only need to open once in your life, but you still have to know which key fits. She didn't ask again for 6 years. That's the kind of person she was. The next 9 years were the build-up, though I didn't experience them as a build-up at the time. I experienced them as a marriage and a job, the ordinary texture of a life. But looking back, I can see now that it was 14 months, concentrated, mostly into the final stretch, before that Tuesday in the boardroom, where the evidence accumulated in a way that made the ending inevitable, even if none of us could see it coming yet. The first discovery came through Priya, 18 months before the boardroom, when she noticed a filing discrepancy in a subsidiary Meridian had spun up in Delaware, a shell entity called Vantport Solutions that existed, according to its own filings, to handle logistics consulting services for 3 of Meridian's largest clients. Priya had no reason to be looking at Vantport. She found it by accident, cross-referencing an invoice number that didn't match anything in the accounting system she managed. She brought it to me on a Thursday evening, in the parking garage instead of the office. The way we'd started meeting once she understood what we were actually building toward. Vantport's registered agent was Corbin, its sole listed officer, beneath a name that meant nothing to either of us at the time, traced back through 2 more shell layers to Renata's mother. It was Priya, again, who pulled the thread further than either of us expected. She'd started keeping a private ledger of every vendor Meridian worked with that had ever been introduced by Corbin or approved without a competing bid, a habit she picked up quietly, the same way I'd quietly moved my shares years earlier. 16 months before the boardroom, she brought in a forensic accountant named Felicia Ruiz, a woman she'd met through a night class in fraud examination she'd been taking on her own time for 2 years, without ever telling me. Because she said she wanted the skill regardless of whether Meridian ever needed it. Felicia worked freelance, took cash for the first month so there'd be no invoice trail back to the company, and confirmed within 3 weeks that Vantport had billed Meridian for consulting hours nobody could account for against any actual deliverable, invoices, with no corresponding meeting notes, no corresponding emails, nothing but numbers that existed because somebody had typed them into a spreadsheet and somebody else had approved them without looking. The total, across 4 years, came to just under $1.6 million. The second discovery came 4 months later, when Walter Greaves, doing his own quiet diligence on the trust's underlying assets, found a signature on a subordinated loan document. A loan Meridian had extended to Vantport for working capital that didn't match my actual signature closely enough to survive a forensic handwriting comparison. Someone had signed my name to authorize a $2.3 million loan I had never seen, never approved, never been told about. I remember sitting in Walter's office when he showed me the two signatures side by side, mine from a mortgage document and the forged one from the loan authorization, and feeling something I hadn't expected to feel, which was not rage but a kind of cold, clean relief. Relief, because for 2 years I'd had a feeling in my stomach that something was being taken from me that I couldn't name, and now, finally, it had a shape. The third discovery took longer, and it came from the least likely place. Odessa Marsh had been Renata's executive assistant for 9 years, long enough to have outlasted 3 reorganizations and 2 office moves, and long enough to have grown quietly tired of being treated, in her own words to Priya months later, like a piece of the furniture that happened to answer phones. Odessa noticed things. She noticed that Renata had started taking calls with her office door fully closed, something she'd never done before, always around the same time each month, close to the calendar dates when Vantport's invoices were due. She noticed a courier delivery addressed not to Meridian, but to a residential address that matched Corbin's, paid for on the company card. She said nothing to anyone for almost a year, partly out of loyalty to the job that paid her mortgage. Partly, she admitted later, because she didn't trust that raising it would change anything except her own employment status. It was Priya who eventually earned her trust, not through pressure, but through patience, small conversations over months, coffee in the break room. Nothing that looked like an investigation from the outside. Odessa finally handed over copies of 3 courier receipts and a printed calendar she'd kept privately, cross-referencing the closed-door calls 6 weeks before the boardroom vote. She asked for nothing in return. She said later, she just wanted, for once, to matter to the outcome instead of just watching it happen to her. The fourth discovery came 6 weeks before the boardroom, when Priya recovered a set of internal emails, forwarded to a personal account of Renata's before being deleted from the company server, discussing a restructuring timeline that named a target date for removing me from the executive team, a date that lined up almost exactly with a separate email discussing divorce counsel. The emails referenced the trust obliquely, in a way that made it clear Renata knew it existed but believed, based on outdated information from years earlier, that its voting authority had been folded back into her own holdings during a refinancing round 2 years prior. She believed she already controlled my shares. She had built an entire timeline, a divorce and a boardroom coup executed in the same week, on the assumption that when she took my title, she'd also be taking my company. I want to tell you about something unrelated to all of this, because it mattered more to me during those 14 months than any spreadsheet or forged signature. My father had a farm outside Macon, 40 acres he'd worked his whole life, and could no longer afford to keep once his hip surgery ate through his savings. 11 months before the boardroom, I sold the watch my grandfather had left me, a modest thing, gold-plated, worn thin at the clasp, not for what it was worth in dollars, which wasn't much, but because it was the only thing I owned outright that I could liquidate, quickly and quietly without Renata noticing, a withdrawal from any account she had visibility into. It covered exactly a third of what my father needed. I covered the rest with savings I'd built in an account Renata didn't know existed, an account I'd started keeping separate. The same month I moved my shares into the trust, though I told myself at the time it was just prudent, not preparation. I missed my daughter's 8th grade honors ceremony that same month because the closing on the farm refinancing happened at the exact hour of the ceremony, and I chose the thing that would keep my father in his home over the thing that would have taken 90 minutes and given me a photograph. She never fully forgave me for that, I understood. Some costs you pay and never get refunded, and you carry them anyway. because the alternative was worse. There was a fifth thread, smaller than the others, that I almost dismissed as irrelevant, and it came from watching Renata herself rather than from any document. 9 months before the boardroom, she started taking a Pilates class on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. Early, before the office opened, a routine so ordinary I never questioned it until I noticed, purely by accident one Tuesday when I'd stayed home sick, that the instructor's studio was 2 blocks from Corbin's accountant's office, and that her calendar, which I still had shared access to at the time, out of nothing more than habit, showed no Pilates entry at all. On the mornings she came home smelling like someone else's cologne, rather than sweat. I didn't confront her. I didn't need another argument I couldn't win with feelings alone. I gave the detail to Priya the way I'd give her anything else by then, a data point, not an accusation, and asked her to note the dates against the Vantport invoice cycle. They lined up more often than chance would allow. It wasn't proof of anything I needed for the boardroom fight, but it told me something about the shape of the marriage I was still, on paper, inside of, and it made the whole decision to protect myself feel less like paranoia and more like arithmetic. 3 weeks before the boardroom, I sat alone in my car outside the office, well past midnight, the kind of empty parking garage that turns your own footsteps into an echo you don't want to hear. I didn't call anyone. I didn't write anything down. I made a promise to myself, silent, the only witness to it the steering wheel under my hands, that whatever happened next, I would not become the kind of man who needed to be believed in order to be right. I would let the paperwork speak. A man who has to yell to be heard hasn't earned the room yet, and I intended to earn it the only way I knew how, quietly, on my own schedule, not theirs. The overplay came 10 days before the boardroom vote, at Corbin's house, during what was supposed to be a low-key family dinner, the kind of gathering that existed, mostly, so everyone could perform normalcy at each other while lawyers worked in the background. I almost didn't go. Renata insisted, said it would look strange if I didn't, said appearances mattered during a transition, and I remember thinking even then that the word transition was doing a lot of quiet work in that sentence. Corbin had had 2 glasses of wine by the time dessert came out, enough to loosen something in him that a more careful man would have kept tied down. He leaned across the table toward me, smiling in the specific way people smile when they believe the outcome is already settled, and he said, "You were never the brains of this operation, Daniel. You were the guy who could build the thing. Renata's always been the one who knew how to run it. No hard feelings, we're just finally being honest about who does what around here." He laughed. Nobody else at the table laughed with him, which told me something too. What Corbin didn't know, what nobody at that dinner table knew, was that Priya was recording the audio on a small device in her bag. Because I'd asked her to come as my assistant, ostensibly to help me manage a schedule conflict later that evening, though we both knew the real reason. I hadn't expected Corbin to hand me exactly what I needed, unprompted, over dessert, in his own dining room, in front of witnesses I hadn't planned for, his wife and 2 of Renata's cousins, all of whom would later confirm, under oath, if it ever came to that, exactly what he'd said and when. He believed he'd already won. That's when people stop being careful. He confessed to a conspiracy, without realizing it was a confession, because in his mind, the outcome was so settled that honesty had become a luxury he could afford. Team Corbin or Team Daniel? Comment 1 if you saw that dinner coming from a mile away. Comment 2 if you think Corbin had any idea what he'd just handed over. The boardroom vote happened 10 days later. Exactly as I've already told you. The security escort, the coffee cup, the divorce papers timed to land while I was still in the elevator. What Renata didn't know, what the board didn't know, was that the moment I got home that night, I called Priya, and Priya called Walter Greaves, exactly as I'd instructed her 7 years earlier. And Walter began drafting an emergency notice to convene a special shareholder meeting under the trust's reserved authority, a clause buried on page 41 of a document nobody at Meridian had read, except the 3 of us and 1 probate judge who'd approved the trust's formation a decade earlier and never thought about it again. The special meeting was called for 3 weeks after the boardroom vote, held not at Meridian's offices, but at a conference room Walter had rented at a business center downtown, neutral ground, deliberately chosen so that nobody could claim the setting itself was an intimidation tactic. I sat at the head of the table this time, not because I demanded the seat, but because the trust's voting authority made it, procedurally, my meeting to run. Renata arrived 12 minutes late, in the navy suit again, flanked by outside counsel she'd hired the week before, a young lawyer who kept glancing at his phone like he already sensed the ground was uneven beneath him. Walter opened with the plainest sentence I'd ever heard him say. 14 years ago, Mr. Okafor placed his founding equity in Meridian Logistics into an irrevocable trust that retained sole voting authority, regardless of his executive title or employment status. That authority was never modified, transferred, or diluted at any point in the last decade, including during the 2019 refinancing round some of you may believe altered it. He let that sentence sit in the room the way you let a verdict sit before you read the sentencing. I watched 3 board members, Devin Ashworth among them, a man I'd personally mentored for 6 years, physically shift their weight away from Renata's side of the table. An inch, maybe 2, but I noticed it the way I'd learned to notice everything by then. Then, point by point, Walter and Priya laid it out. First, the Vantport shell entity and its ownership trail back to Renata's mother, with Felicia Ruiz's forensic accounting summary distributed to every board member in a sealed folder, showing the $1.6 million in unaccounted consulting invoices laid out year by year, month by month, next to the actual deliverables that never existed. Felicia herself, present at Walter's request, answered 2 direct questions from a board member skeptical of the methodology, and answered them so plainly, so free of hedging, that the skepticism visibly drained out of the room within the space of that single exchange. Second, the forged signature on the $2.3 million loan authorization, supported by the forensic handwriting analysis Walter had commissioned 8 months earlier, with the 2 signatures projected side by side on a screen, so even the board members with no expertise in handwriting could see plainly that they were not made by the same hand. Third, Odessa Marsh's quiet testimony, read aloud by Walter from a signed affidavit, since Odessa had declined to appear in person, detailing the closed-door calls and the courier receipts, timed against the invoice dates, with a precision that left no room for coincidence. Fourth, the internal emails discussing the coordinated timeline between the restructuring vote and the divorce filing, recovered before deletion and preserved with a timestamp chain that would survive any challenge to their authenticity. And finally, the audio from Corbin's dining room, played once, in full, his own voice confirming what the emails had only implied, that the plan had never been about restructuring a company, it had been about seizing one, using a marriage as the mechanism. I watched the board turn, one member at a time, the way ice breaks up on a lake, not all at once but in a spreading pattern you can trace backward to a single point of pressure. Devin spoke first, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it in a boardroom. I need to recuse myself from any further vote on this matter pending independent review, he said. And I understood that sentence for what it was, not neutrality, but abandonment. The sound of an alliance dissolving in real time, because it had never been loyalty to begin with, only proximity to whoever seemed to be winning. 2 more board members followed within the hour. One by email before the meeting had even formally closed, a woman named Priscilla Nkemelu, who had sat on the board for 5 years, and who sent a 2-line message that said only that she could no longer, in good conscience, be associated with the restructuring resolution, as written. A 4th member, a longtime friend of Comsorm named Reggie Vaughn, who had championed the Vantport contract in the first place, tried briefly to argue that the accounting discrepancies could be explained by aggressive but legitimate consulting fee structures, and was met with such total silence from the rest of the room that he stopped mid-sentence and didn't speak again for the remainder of the meeting. Renata's outside counsel asked for a recess. Walter granted it. When the meeting reconvened 40 minutes later, Corbin himself had been contacted by phone and had reportedly told his own lawyer, in a conversation Priya heard secondhand through Odessa 2 days later, that he wasn't going to let his sister go down for something he'd helped build. A sentence that read, depending on how generously you wanted to interpret it, as either an offer to take responsibility or an admission that there was, in fact, something to take responsibility for. Either way, it did Renata no favors in a room where every board member present had just watched a recording of him, drunkenly confessing to the entire scheme over dessert. The vote to dissolve the current board's restructuring resolution and reinstate the trust's full oversight authority passed without a single abstention. Renata didn't yell. I'll give her that, in the end, whatever else I could say about her. She sat very still, her hands flat on the table, the way they'd been the day she fired me. Except this time the white knuckles weren't performance. They were the real thing. Finally visible, because there was nothing left to perform for. When it was over, when the resolution passed and the room began to empty, she said one sentence to me, quiet enough that only I heard it. I didn't think you'd actually planned for this. I told her I hadn't planned for it. I'd just refused to be unprepared for it, which is a different thing, and a truer one. She left with what remained, which by the time the settlement finalized 8 months later, amounted to a minority equity stake and a handful of consulting contracts. A few contracts, small enough that the phrase itself became, in Priya's dry retelling of it months later, something close to a punchline. Comment 1 if you think Corbin actually believed what he told his lawyer. Comment 2 if you think he was just trying to sound like the hero of his own story one last time before it ended. 6 months after that meeting, I was sitting on the back porch of a rental house I'd taken on the edge of Decatur. Small. Nothing like the house Renata and I had shared, but mine in a way that house had never fully been. My daughter, Maya, was 15 by then, and she'd asked, over dinner one evening, why I hadn't fought harder in public, why I hadn't gone to the press, why I'd let it all happen so quietly when I clearly had the evidence to make a much bigger noise about it. I told her that noise is what people make when they're not sure they're going to win. I told her patience isn't the absence of a plan, it's the plan, stretched out long enough that by the time it arrives, nobody can argue with the outcome. She sat with that for a while, the way teenagers do when they're deciding whether an idea is wisdom or just an excuse dressed up nicely. Eventually she said, "That's a very you thing to say, Dad." And I took that as the closest thing to forgiveness she'd offered me since the honors ceremony I'd missed. Some weekends Maya came to stay with me. And slowly, those weekends stopped feeling like custody arrangements and started feeling like something closer to a rhythm. We started a small ritual, the two of us, driving out to Macon most months to see my father on his 40 acres, the same acres the watch and the second savings account had kept in the family. And on the drive back, she'd ask questions about the company, not out of obligation, but because she'd started to find the whole story genuinely interesting, the way teenagers sometimes surprise you by finding meaning in the parts of your life you assumed were boring to anyone but you. Priya stayed on as Chief Operating Officer once the dust settled, a title she'd earned in every sense that mattered, before it was ever official on paper. We didn't become anything more than what we already were, for the better part of a year after the settlement, because I understood, and I think she understood too, that trust built during a 14-month campaign of quiet evidence gathering isn't the same as trust built for a relationship, and the two needed time to become the same thing, instead of being rushed into looking like it. There was an evening, maybe 8 months after the settlement, when she told me about Charlotte, about the company that had folded around her years earlier, while she sat in meetings watching problems accumulate that nobody would let her name, and she said that the 14 months we'd spent building the case against Renata and Corbin were the first time in her working life she'd felt like naming a problem out loud actually mattered to the outcome. I understood that better than I let on, too. It was Maya, of all people, who noticed what was happening between us first. Over a Sunday dinner, the three of us had started sharing every few weeks, and said, without much ceremony, "You two know you like each other, right?" Neither of us denied it. That was, in its own understated way, the beginning. There was one more thing I did before I let the whole matter close for good. Marcus Webb, the head of security who wouldn't meet my eyes, the day I was walked out, had 2 kids in private school and a mortgage and a boss who could end his career with a signature, and I'd understood that the day had happened. 6 weeks after the settlement, I asked Priya to quietly push through a promotion for him, Director of Facilities and Security, across all 3 of Meridian's regional offices, along with 2 years of back pay adjustments he was owed from a pay band correction that had been sitting unaddressed on someone's desk for 3 years. It cost the company almost nothing. It cost me nothing dramatic. But I wanted him to know that the day he looked away wasn't the day that defined whether I saw him as a person worth taking care of. I did something similar for Odessa Marsh, though it took longer to arrange, since she was, technically, still Renata's assistant when all of this unfolded. And there was a period of a few months where nobody quite knew what her role would become once Renata's day-to-day involvement with the company wound down. I offered her a position managing executive operations for the reconstituted leadership team, at a salary that finally reflected 9 years of being treated like furniture that happened to answer phones. She cried a little when I told her. Not out of gratitude exactly, she was careful to say, but out of relief. The specific relief of being seen for something other than your usefulness to somebody else's plan. I understood that feeling better than I let on. Felicia Ruiz, the forensic accountant Priya had found through a night class, became Meridian's permanent internal auditor, a role that didn't exist before all of this, and that I insisted on creating because a company that had let $1.6 million disappear into a shell entity for 4 years, without anyone noticing, had a structural problem, not just a Renata and Corbin problem. And I wasn't interested in solving half the issue and calling it finished. A year after the settlement, on a Saturday in late spring, my father called from Macon to say the tractor had finally given out for good, an old machine older than my own marriage had been. And instead of paying for the repair myself, the way I would have quietly done a few years earlier, I drove Maya and Priya both out to the farm, and we spent the afternoon looking at replacement models with him, the 3 generations of a family that had almost lost this land arguing cheerfully over horsepower and diesel efficiency in a way that felt, for the first time, in a long time, like ordinary life instead of crisis management. My father, who had never fully understood what happened at Meridian and never asked me to explain it twice, looked at Priya across the hood of a used John Deere and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "This one's got sense. Don't lose her." I told him I didn't plan to. Maya's relationship with her mother took longer to find any kind of ground, and I never pushed it in either direction, because I'd learned enough by then to know that a 14-month campaign built on patience doesn't translate cleanly into a teenager's grief over a parent who'd made choices that were harder to explain to a child than to a courtroom. Renata reached out to Maya on her own, slowly, without going through me. And by the following spring, the 2 of them were having dinner together every few weeks, quiet, careful dinners that Maya described to me afterward in short sentences that told me she was still deciding how much of her mother she was willing to let back in. I never asked her to forgive Renata faster than she was ready to. I understood, better than most people could, that forgiveness on somebody else's schedule isn't forgiveness. It's just another kind of pressure, and I'd spent enough of my own life refusing to be rushed into decisions before I understood their weight. Devin Ashworth, the board member who recused himself first, stayed on Meridian's board through the transition, and 6 months later he told me, over coffee, that recusing himself hadn't been an act of courage, just the only honest thing left available to him once the recording played, and he respected me more for never once bringing it up publicly than he would have if I'd made an example of him the way some men in my position would have wanted to. I told him a boardroom full of people who abandon a bad idea the moment they see. Proof isn't a boardroom full of villains. It's just a boardroom full of people. And the only ones who mattered to me long-term were the ones who stayed useful once the dust settled. Devon stayed useful. Reggie Vaughn did not, and resigned from the board on his own within the year, before anyone had to ask him to. Priscilla Nkemelu, the board member who'd sent the 2-line resignation message during the recess, wrote me a longer letter almost a year later, unprompted, saying she'd spent months turning over how close she'd come to voting the other way out of nothing more than habit and comfort, and that the experience had changed how carefully she read every proposal that crossed her desk afterward. At Meridian and at the 2 other boards she sat on, I kept that letter in the same drawer as the index cards. It felt like it belonged there, a different kind of evidence. Proof that people can notice their own near misses and let it change them, which is rarer than anyone likes to admit. If you've made it this far, I want to talk to you directly for a moment, because I think there's something in this story worth more than the satisfaction of watching the people who wronged me end up with a few contracts instead of a company. Somewhere in your life, right now, there is probably a small irregularity you've noticed and chosen not to make a fuss about. An 11% markup on an insurance line. A gesture that felt a little too warm, a little too soon. A sentence someone said that you told yourself you misheard. I'm not telling you to blow up your life over it. I'm telling you to write it down. Get an index card, a real physical one, and write the date and the detail, nothing more, and put it in a drawer you don't open often. Do that every time something small nags at you, and you decide, for the sake of peace, to let it go for now. You are not required to act on it today. You are only required to remember that you noticed it, because the people who count on your forgetting are usually the same people who will, eventually, hand you everything you need, the moment they believe they've already won. I still have that drawer, by the way. It's mostly empty these days, which I've come to think of as its own kind of report card on the life I'm living now, but I haven't gotten rid of it. Some tools you keep, even after the job that made you build them, is finished. The same way I never sold the workbench my grandfather left, along with that watch, even though I don't build anything on it anymore. You keep the tool, because the next problem doesn't announce itself in advance, and the person who's ready for it is always the person who never quite put the tools away. Patience isn't weakness dressed up in a nicer word. It's the only kind of power that's still yours when everyone else has already made up their mind about how the story ends.